Hello anatomists, and welcome to Endocrinology for Human Anatomy and Physiology. This lecture is split up into 5 different parts. First, we're going to look at the similarities and differences between the nervous and the endocrine system. We're going to look at the different groups of hormones. We'll look at 2 different ways a hormone works, the way it attaches. Fourth, we're going to look at what upregulation and downregulation means. And finally, we're going to look at the hormone function. How a hormone is signaled, where does it go, what's the difference between the signaling molecule, signaling cell, and the target cell, and so on. Alright, so first let's look at a quick comparison between nervous and the endocrine. So, of course, the big primary role is in communication between the both. One cell conveying a message to another cell. How do you get your gastrocnemius to contract? Through the nervous system. The optic nerve sends a signal to the visual cortex of the occipital lobe, then to the brainstem, then down the spinal cord, then to the sciatic nerve, and finally the gastrocnemius saying contract. How do you get yourself to drink water when, say, your blood pressure is low? Well, the juxtaglomerular cells release the hormone renin into the blood. The liver releases the hormone angiotensinogen into the blood. It's converted to angiotensin 1 in the blood and then to angiotensin 2 in the lungs, and then travels to the hypothalamus to say, hey, I'm really thirsty right now. You drink some water and restore your blood homeostasis. And so both are involved in communication. In both of these examples, one organ was able to get a second organ to do something. And as long as we're here, let's label these 2 organs. The first organ is called the signaling organ, and the second is called the target organ. Or if we're just talking cells, we can say the signaling cell and the target cell. Any other similarities between nervous and endocrine? Sure. They both use chemical messengers like epinephrine and acetylcholine. They both are regulated by negative feedback loops. Now for some differences. First, speed. The time it takes a nervous signal to go from the occipital lobe to the brainstem, down the spinal cord, out the sciatic nerve, and finally to the gastrocnemius is 0.01 seconds. That's very fast. That's because the signal in myelinated neurons travel at 447 miles an hour. Very fast. Where the message to go from the macula densa cells to the glomerular cells to the blood to the lungs and then to the hypothalamus might take maybe 5 minutes. That's the endocrine system. Which leads me to another big difference, the distance that the chemical travels. You see, an endocrine signaling gland releases its hormone messenger into the blood. Then it travels in the blood all the way until it eventually reaches its target gland. I mean, it takes 60 seconds for blood to complete one full cycle in the body. But for the chemical that's released from the presynaptic neuron only travels a short distance to the postsynaptic neuron. And that's, of course, across the synapse. Just FYI kind of thing, there are even more types of communication using chemicals. For example, there's direct communication where cells are physically touching each other. And I know you've definitely seen this with gap junctions. There's also paracrine communication where the cells are in close enough proximity that the chemical doesn't even need to be released into the blood. And there's also autocrine communication where the chemical released from the signaling cell not only affects target cells, it also affects itself as well and leads to changes in itself. We see this in monocytes, B cells, T cells. Okay, next question. What groups of hormones are there? So I've put this table together for you to help you organize your thoughts and see the various kinds of hormones how they may be grouped, from which organ they are released from, and the examples of these groups of hormones. There are single amino acid type hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, melatonin. There are peptide type hormones. These are also made from amino acid subunits and are generally less than 50 amino acids long. A lot of hormones are peptide hormones like ADH, antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, and GnRH. You also have protein size hormones like parathyroid hormone. Proteins are chains of amino acids and greater than 50 of these subunits long. Then you have your steroid type lipid derivative hormones. These are your reproductive hormones like testosterone and estrogen, and your adrenal gland hormones like cortisol and cortisone. Another group are your eicosanoid type lipid derivative steroids like prostaglandins and your thromboxanes and prostacyclins. And you also have your purines like ATP and your nitric oxide as well. Now, these three groups are all hydrophilic, and these two groups are hydrophobic. Why is this important? Because this will determine how it will behave once it reaches its target cell. This leads us into understanding the difference between plasma membrane receptors and intracellular receptors. You remember how the plasma membranes of our cells are made up of these phospholipid bilayers, making the very large inside layer of the membrane non-polar and hydrophobic, and sandwiched between two very thin hydrophilic layers? Well, this creates a structure where hydrophilic molecules cannot pass freely through, yet lipophilic, or you could say hydrophobic molecules, can pass through because both are made up of roughly the same stuff. This forces your amino acid derivative type hormones to require a second messenger on the inside of the cell to continue delivering the message, because amino acids, peptides, and proteins, these are hydrophilic. They can't get through. They do bind to what are called plasma membrane receptors, but they also need another molecule to convey the message on the inside of the cell. Thus, hydrophilic hormones become first messengers, and the molecules waiting on the inside of the cells are called second messengers. The three most commonly used second messengers in our cells are cyclic AMP, calcium, and cyclic GMP. Three common plasma membrane receptors are your Gprotein coupled receptors, receptor tyrosine kinase, and lastly your guanylate cyclase receptors. This is an example of what can happen with a Gprotein coupled receptor. There is a cascade of events that occur inside of the cell. When a hormone or any ligand binds, the receptor undergoes a conformational change, signaling the G protein to become activated. This activates another enzyme, which in turn converts ATP to cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP activates kinases, which alter enzymatic activity in the cell, like increase glucose metabolism or increase aquaporin production, like in the nephrons, or decrease osteoclast function. With every step, the effects of the hormone are magnified. And so the phenomenon is referred to as a signal transduction cascade. The longer the cascade, the greater the degree of what we call signal amplification. In this example here, just one single epinephrine molecule triggers 100,000 glucose molecules to be freed, to go from glycogen to be freed into those glucose molecules. The second type of receptors are the intracellular receptors. They're floating around in the cytosol, in the cytoplasm. Although your steroids and your eicosanoids are hydrophobic, they still may bind to transmembrane receptors, but they can also pass right through the phospholipid membrane, where intracellular receptors are waiting in the cytoplasm. Once a ligand binds, again, a conformational change occurs in the receptor, activating it, and it can translocate all the way to the nucleus and the DNA binding domains on the receptor, then binds to responsive elements in the DNA, increasing or decreasing transcription or translation, or increasing or decreasing the rate of mRNA synthesis, and so on. An agonist is a chemical that binds and activates the receptor, but an antagonist is a chemical that binds but does not activate the receptor. So when agonists increase and persist over a long period of time, like when addicted to opiate drugs, in order to maintain homeostasis, the body undergoes downregulation, and what you notice is an increased tolerance level. What happens then? Well, you have to take more than you did before to achieve the same pleasure. You have essentially decreased your sensitivity to endorphins by decreasing the endorphin receptors on your target cells. So here's one of your cells, and normally you're going to have some set number of receptors for a particular hormone. Here we have 5 receptors. As blood brings hormones to the cell, some may bind, some may not. The more ligand there is, the better chance they'll bind and activate the receptor. But your cell is happy with, say, 3 receptors being activated at any one time, just as an example. Then suddenly an agonist is introduced, which looks structurally similar, therefore it fits into the receptor and it binds. And because it's an agonist, it activates the receptors as the natural ligand did. The catch, though, is that there is entirely too much of it activating more receptors than usual. The only way the cells know how to deal with this problem is by down-regulating the cell. It actually engulfs as many receptors as needed to bring back roughly the original number of activated receptors to restore homeostasis. This is the result of this added agonist. The cell has become less sensitive to the chemical by down-regulating its receptors, which is what increasing tolerance is. Of course, if the agonist was suddenly removed, the changes of the natural ligand finding those few receptors is low. This can cause the withdrawal symptoms like pain, for example. Take caffeine, for example. How is caffeine a stimulant? Well, caffeine competes with this molecule called adenosine. And in the brain, ATP is broken down and the byproduct is adenosine, part of ATP. Well, from the time you wake up all the way until the time you finally sleep again, adenosine is building up in the brain, building up, and it becomes toxic. And so it's sleep that allows for the cells to get rid of this adenosine and basically start all over in the morning. So adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter on the brain. So when it binds, it calms the brain and decreases brain activity. Well, caffeine acts as an antagonist, binding, fitting and binding, but not activating. And the result is no calming. It basically inhibits the inhibitor. caffeine inhibits the inhibitor adenosine, because adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And so, of course, the result is no calming, and an increase in adenosine receptors in the brain results. The brain is upregulating adenosine receptors in an attempt to increase the calmness to bring back homeostasis. The brain has increased sensitivity to naturally occurring adenosine by increasing its target receptors. What's the result? Well, I feel more tired. Now I need 2 cups of coffee today instead of 1. And so, of course, this goes on and on and on. You continue to need more and more and more, because the brain itself, it's the only thing it knows to do is to upregulate, to increase those receptors, to try to calm the brain back down to where it was, and therefore it continues to make more and more of these receptors. And if suddenly caffeine is taken away, now suddenly there is an extreme amount of calming. Why? Because adenosine can now reach all those receptors and calm way more than the brain would even normally like. Very good. Last piece of the puzzle. Although there are only 8 glands that are considered to be the endocrine system, there are many more organs that also make and secrete hormones with very important interrelationships with these original 8 glands maintaining homeostasis. Most endocrine glands make maybe 1 or 2 or maybe 3 hormones, so that it makes it very easy to remember which gland makes which hormone, and it makes it relatively easy to remember which their target glands are. And so for this last section, it's going to be fairly straightforward. So we're going to study 4 areas. 1, we're going to name the signaling gland. We're going to ask the question, how is the gland triggered, or how is homeostasis disturbed in the first place? Which hormone does the signaling gland make? Then we name the target organ, and we ask the question, how is homeostasis restored? But because the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland make so many hormones, we'll take a closer look at these 2 areas specifically, and we'll kind of zoom in and pause here for a second. All right, let's get started. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus provides the highest level of endocrine control because it makes so many hormones. Coordinating centers in the hypothalamus regulate nervous and endocrine systems in 3 different ways. Number 1, the hypothalamus secretes 2 hormones directly into general circulation. Now, from this diagram, I don't see how ADH and oxytocin are being secreted into the blood. It looks like these green neurons are innervating the posterior pituitary, and that's about it. But if I add the entire hypophyseal portal system, I can see how ADH and oxytocin are secreted into the bloodstream. It's the inferior hypophyseal artery located in the posterior pituitary that receives the 2 hormones and transports them to their target glands. More on this in just a second. Number 2, the hypothalamus also secretes releasing and inhibiting regulatory hormones to control anterior pituitary secretions. You see this purple arrow right here? This is representing hypothalamic neurons that make and secrete regulating hormones that do make it to the blood supply, but only travel 1 inch right to the anterior pituitary. You see, it's actually the anterior pituitary gland that makes its own hormones that will reach the whole body. So, while the hypothalamus is like the commander of the army, giving orders to the pituitary gland, the pituitary is the general of the army who actually has the power to release soldiers out into the field. This is the reason why so many hormones are released from the hypothalamus and have an RH at the end of their names. For example, TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. There you'll see RH at the end of a lot of these from the hypothalamus. TRH makes its way through the superior hypophyseal artery and reaches its target gland, the anterior pituitary, where it will cause the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary to release TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, and then TSH will make its way to the thyroid for the thyroid to release its own hormones, T3 and T4. PRF is prolactin releasing hormone. It causes the pituitary to release PRL, prolactin. Here's another one, CRH, cortical releasing hormone. This hormone makes its way to the anterior pituitary to cause ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, to be released, and ACTH then makes its way to the adrenal glands. All right, and finally, number 3. The hypothalamus contains autonomic nervous system centers that control the adrenal medullae through sympathetic innervation. A direct all the way to the adrenal medulla. Let's now walk through all the moving parts of the hypophyseal portal system to get a better grasp at who is making which hormone, and where does it go, and how does it travel. And then the last piece will introduce each hormone, who makes it, what's the trigger, what's the target organ, and back to homeostasis. And that's it. So let's zoom in here on the hypophyseal portal system and see what all the components are here. So in this top area here, we have the hypothalamus. The bottom, we have the pituitary gland, and we can split this up into anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. I see we have green neurons innervating starting from the hypothalamus down to the posterior pituitary. We have purple ones starting up in the hypothalamus and coming down, reaching the infundibulum of the pituitary. And we have red ones that start up in the hypothalamus and directly innervate the adrenal medulla of the adrenal glands. So it doesn't really matter where we start here, but let's just start with the green ones. So these are hypothalamic nuclei. They actually produce antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and they're released into the capillary here. This would be the inferior hypophyseal artery. Here's the capillary network here. But this is actually down in the posterior pituitary. So you can say, although the hypothalamus produces ADH and oxytocin, you can also say that the posterior pituitary, technically speaking, secretes the two hormones because this is where it occurs. It occurs way down here. Okay, very good. Then we have these purple ones here, these hypothalamic neurons here, and these guys produce the regulating. These are like the reproductive ones. These ones are these innervate the superior part of the infundibulum here, and the blood will then take the releasing hormones, make their way all the way to the anterior pituitary, where we have more endocrine cells waiting to receive those releasing hormones and then to make their own hormones and send them out to the body. So that's how the anterior is different than the posterior. In the anterior portion of the pituitary gland, you actually have endocrine cells making more hormones. So again, just like we saw before, how you have some kind of RH hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to make more, it'll receive it, and then the anterior pituitary cells will make more, another hormone, and then send it out to the body through the veins of the hypophyseal portal system. So that's the hypophyseal portal system in a nutshell. Very good, guys. We're on the home stretch. We're almost done. We're going to look at just a few of the glands. We're going to look at the thyroid gland. We're going to look at the parathyroid gland, the adrenal glands, the pineal gland, and finally the pancreas. And for each of these, we're going to ask the same type of questions. What does the gland make? How is it triggered? In other words, how is homeostasis disturbed? What is the target gland or the target cells that these hormones will reach? And then finally, how is homeostasis restored? Starting with the thyroid, it looks like the thyroid, I'm going to ask for these three hormones, T3, T4, and calcitonin. How did all this start? I mean, who told the thyroid to secrete T3 and T4? Well, it's the anterior pituitary. But who told the anterior pituitary? Well, it's the hypothalamus in the brain. So the hypothalamus secretes TRH. It reaches the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary secretes TSH, makes its way into the blood all the way to the thyroid, and the thyroid makes T3 and T4. Well, what caused this? I mean, what triggered this in the beginning? Well, it's actually quite simple. If we just continue this, we can see that there's a negative feedback loop. T3 and T4 reaches all of our body cells. T3 and T4 increase in calcium, which is usually, you want to think of the thyroid gland as the good gland, because you generally want to have more than enough calcium. Why? Well, because when it senses that there's plenty of calcium in the blood, it will secrete calcitonin, and it will reach the bone, and in the bone it will inhibit osteoclasts. If you remember, osteoclasts break up bony matrix to release calcium into the blood. That way all of our cells can use calcium. That way our muscles can undergo muscle contraction. That way our nerves can propagate nerve impulses. We need calcium. But when there's plenty of calcium, the thyroid will sense this. Calcitonin will then be secreted from the thyroid. It dumps it into the blood, reaches the bone, and says, hey, stop breaking up bone because we have plenty of calcium already. Also, calcitonin can trigger the kidneys to secrete and get rid of excess calcium. So generally you want to think of the thyroid as the good one, because we don't want to break up our bones, we want to build our bones. So it'll actually inhibit, calcitonin will inhibit the osteoclasts of the bone it'll tell the osteoclast to stop breaking up bone. We have plenty of calcium in the body. We don't need any more coming from the bone. Next, we have the parathyroid. And the parathyroid gland basically does the opposite of the thyroid gland. The parathyroid glands are on the posterior side of the thyroid. It's just the same, it's right in the same area. There's just these four little dots on the back side of the thyroid. And the parathyroid basically does the opposite of the thyroid. So instead of depositing calcium into the bone, it will actually take calcium away from the bone. Well, why would it do that? You can think of the parathyroid as the bad gland, because we don't want to break up our bone, right? We want to build our bone. Well, it's when it senses decreased calcium, when we're not taking in enough calcium in our diet, the parathyroid says, oh, no. We need enough calcium in our blood. That's because we need our muscles to contract and our nerves to propagate signals. So what does the parathyroid gland do? It secretes a hormone called Parathyroid. Well, that makes it easy. The parathyroid gland secretes parathyroid hormone, and its target cells are the osteoclasts and osteocytes, as well as in the kidneys. What does it tell the osteoclasts to do? It says activate, get going. So the osteoclast's job, of course, is breaking up bony matrix. So the osteoclast will begin to break up, and release calcium into the blood. That way we restore blood homeostasis. That way all of our muscles and all of our nerves have plenty of calcium. Now, isn't that a bad thing? Well, I mean, you can kind of think of it. I mean, it's not the parathyroid's fault. It's just trying to restore homeostasis. If we don't take in enough calcium, our body's going to get calcium from somewhere. Guess where it's going to come from? It's going to come from our bone. It's going to break up our bone to make sure that we have enough calcium. So it's the osteoclasts that are stimulated by the parathyroid gland. Osteoclasts are sensitive to the parathyroid hormone. Also, it inhibits osteocytes. Osteocytes maintain and they build, and so it'll actually inhibit osteocytes, stimulate osteoclasts to dump enough calcium into the blood to restore blood homeostasis. Also, it'll inhibit calcium excretion. So instead of, like how we saw before, when we're taking in plenty of calcium, causing the kidneys to get rid of excess, the parathyroid gland reaches the kidneys, and the kidneys are sensitive to the parathyroid gland, saying, hey, stop getting rid of it, let's put the calcium back into the blood because we don't have enough of it. That's the parathyroid gland. Next, we have the adrenal glands. I know there's a lot going on here. Don't worry, I'm going to walk you through everything. Now, there's actually two regions in the adrenal glands. We have the adrenal cortex, this outer shell, and the adrenal medulla. Adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. Well, the adrenal cortex actually produces more than 24 steroid hormones called corticosteroids. And so you see, there's so much more than what we have here. I mean, we have androgens, estrogens, cortisol, corticosterone. There's actually even more than what we have here. And these are essential for metabolic functions. We also have the adrenal medulla. That's this inner region right here. And the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, the stress hormones. Another word for epinephrine is adrenaline. Now, the adrenal cortex here secretes aldosterone. So we're going to see what their target organs are and what triggers them. Now, this whole diagram is what we call the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We touch on this system with the cardiovascular system, the urinary system, the acid-base system, even we touch on it in the pulmonary system. So, and once again, and here we are in the endocrine system. So this must be a very important system, this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And it all begins with when blood pressure decreases. You see these macula densa cells right here? These macula densa cells sample sodium and chloride and potassium, and when those ions are too low, this must mean that there is low blood pressure. So they send a signal to the juxtaglomerular cells, or the glomerular cells, and the glomerular cells release a hormone called renin. Renin gets dumped into the blood, and angiotensinogen that's made in the liver also gets dumped into the blood, and it's converted into angiotensin 1. The angiotensin 1 up in the lungs gets converted one more time by ACE to become angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 does all kinds of things. It looks like we have 5 different things angiotensin 2 does. First, it's a potent vasoconstrictor. It increases vasoconstriction. So as you can imagine, if you can constrict your blood vessels, you can restore blood pressure once again. Also, angiotensin 2 will cause the pituitary gland to secrete ADH. ADH will be dumped into the blood, make it all the way to the nephrons of the kidney, and cause the kidneys to create these aquaporins to increase more water reabsorption. And if you have more water, you will once again increase blood pressure and restore homeostasis. Also, angiotensin II can tell the hypothalamus, hey, I'm thirsty, and so what do? You go for some water, and once again, you drink water, you restore blood pressure and blood homeostasis. Also, I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to skip the adrenal glands just for a second, and also up in the nephron of the kidneys, it can also cause the efferent arteriole, this one right here, to constrict, and thereby increasing filtration, because you're kind of kinking the hose up here, increasing filtration. That way it ensures that our blood is being filtered. And finally, angiotensin II causes the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone will make its way to the nephrons of the kidney and cause the increase of the reabsorption of sodium. And of course, if sodium is being dumped into the dumped into the blood, water will follow, and thereby increasing blood water, blood pressure, and increasing blood homeostasis. All right, and finally, the hypothalamus can also cause the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, the stress hormones, to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, increase glucose synthesis. Now, why, if you remember, let's just go back. I remember from one of our previous slides, the hypothalamus has a direct connection through the sympathetic neurons directly to the adrenal medulla. There it is right there. What does the hypothalamus do? It reaches the adrenal medulla and causes the adrenal medulla to produce and secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are your stress hormones. And it does even more than these. I mean, skeletal muscle, it really works on all kinds of tissues in the body. But here's just a few: increasing blood glucose, increasing heart rate, even lipolysis, access to our fat cells, increasing blood pressure. All these things will increase blood pressure. Once again, that's the adrenal glands. Second to the last gland that we're going to talk about is the pineal gland. That's this little guy right here. The pineal gland is very much involved in the circadian rhythm. It makes melatonin. Melatonin makes you sleepy. When is melatonin secreted? When we don't have light filtering into our eyes. So when the sun goes down, we get sleepy. Why do we get sleepy? Well, it's because when the light no longer enters our eyes, melatonin begins to be secreted, making us sleepy. And that's why we have night shift on our phones, getting rid of the blue light to kind of help us, but that's probably not it doesn't do everything. But of course, if we can get rid of all of our electronics and not have any lights on in the house, that's of course the best way to do it. That way you get sleepy at dusk, and that way your circadian rhythm is maintained. That's melatonin secreted by the pineal gland. Finally, last one, the pancreas. The pancreas have two kinds of cells. You got your beta cells and you got your alpha cells. Your beta cells secrete insulin and your alpha cells secrete glucagon. When do the beta cells secrete insulin? Well, when blood glucose increases after a feeding. So when you eat, your blood sugar goes up, and that will And your beta cells will sense this, and they will start making insulin and dump it into the blood. What does that do? Well, it increases glucose uptake into the body, into your skeletal muscles, anywhere where you need, as well as glycogen production. Glycogen is the stored form of glucose. When blood glucose is low, your alpha cells will sense low blood glucose and secrete glucagon. Glucagon basically does the opposite. Once it reaches the liver will then break down glycogen to free up glucose and thereby increasing blood glucose once again to maintain that blood homeostasis. That's the end of all the endocrine chapter. That's all I have for you guys. Thank you very much for listening. I know it's a lot. You want to get some paper out, make a couple of tables, some comparisons between the nervous and the endocrine, the groups of hormones, plasma membranes versus intracellular membranes, upregulation, downregulation, and finally make a nice table of the signaling cells, the target cells, the hormones that the signaling cells release, and what caused the disturbance of homeostasis, and how is homeostasis once again restored. Thank you guys again very much, and study well.